Bias refers to any errors or inaccuracies in data collection. In general, the interviewer that is collecting the data can help to avoid bias by developing trust and rapport with the person they're interviewing. This can include attentively listening to their answers, asking for clarification if you don't understand their answer, and also making sure that you have a systematic method of recording their responses. The person being interviewed, or the interviewee, can also introduce bias. This could be either intentionally or unintentionally. Some unintentional ways the interviewee could bias the data is by giving the answer they think the interviewer wants to hear, or maybe because they don't understand the question and they're afraid to ask for clarification. That's why developing rapport with the interviewer can help. They could also intentionally bias the interview because of things that they like or they don't like. Maybe if they're in a focus group about McDonald's new packaging and they really hate McDonald's, they could bias it with their feelings. Maybe they also just feel uncomfortable about the questions in the interview, and that introduces bias. Or if they intentionally lie about their answers because they think that's what's socially acceptable. Those are all ways the interviewee could bias an interview. Finally, bias can also be introduced because of the situation. One type is non-response bias. This happens when a certain group of people do not participate in an interview because they're not able to or don't want to. For example, if a researcher went to a mall between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m. to ask shoppers questions, they might not get students because they would be in school or people that work typical 9 to 5 jobs. Most of the people they ask might be retirees or people that aren't working or people that work on unusual schedules like night shift. These people might have different opinions than students or people that work the typical 9 to 5s. The location of the interview also matters. For example, if you're being interviewed at your place of work, you might not be comfortable sharing negative views of your employer. So your comfort level can help you to get more open and honest responses from the interview, so the situation is also very important. In general, here are 9 interview tips that can help you avoid bias. Number 1, train the person that does the interview. If possible, it's best if you can use the same interview for all interviewees. Just imagine every job search. When looking for a new candidate, we always try to use the same interview panel for each person interviewing for a job. That way they can be more fair when you have seen all candidates. You get a better comparison. The same thing is true for any general interview. You want to use the same interviewer to give everyone a consistent experience. Sometimes this isn't possible though, like if you're interviewing people in different countries, you would need to train interviewers in the different locations. In this case, how you can make sure you have consistency is by following the same procedure for asking questions, using the same prompts, having defined information about what to look for in your answers, and having a planned way to end the interview. Notes for all the interviews should also be recorded consistently, so you need some kind of template for this to go in. Number 2, establish rapport. Before you even start the interview, a researcher can establish their credibility, their knowledge, their confidence, their enthusiasm. These all help to establish rapport with the interviewee. Also, just by being pleasant and sincere and letting the interviewee know that you really value the information they have to share is important to help them feel comfortable and at ease, and this will help to lead to more truthful answers, and they won't be afraid to ask for clarification if they need it. Number 3, the interviewer should always introduce themselves and the purpose of the study and the interview before they start. It's also very important that the interviewer lets the interviewee know that their responses will remain anonymous. This can help the interviewee to want to participate more fully when they feel they understand the purpose of the research and the value that they can potentially bring to the table, but that the responses will be kept anonymous so they don't have to worry about that being shared anywhere. Number 4, get permission to record. Recording the interview with audio and video can help to keep an accurate record of responses if it needs to be reviewed. However, this can only be done with permission. One important note is that if you do record, it can also introduce bias because the interviewee might respond slightly differently if they're being recorded and they know that anonymity factor might not be fully preserved. So if the interviewee does not agree to being recorded, or if you're interviewing on a very sensitive subject, you can take written notes instead of recording, but again, you'd have to take those notes in the same way or using a template for all respondents. Number 5, funnel your questions. This is extremely important for unstructured interviews as well as for structured interviews. I mentioned previously that you might want to start with easy questions, but typically for an interview, we call these your more general questions, and then you funnel to the more narrow focus questions that are specifically related to the theme of the interview. This is called funneling. So for example, if you wanted to learn about pizza, you could start with an open-ended question like, tell me about your experiences with food. And if the individual identifies that they enjoy pizza, you could ask something more specific like, what are your favorite pizza toppings? You shouldn't ask closed-ended questions. That means something that could be answered with a yes or no, because in an interview, you really want detailed responses on feelings and opinions, not just a yes or no answer. Another example is your broad issue could be, what do you consider entertaining? Then narrow the topic to, what type of movie do you consider most entertaining? If the person says they like movies. Then if they identify they like action movies, you can narrow farther and say, what do you find most entertaining about action movies? And then finally, if they say that they like the CGI and like being transported to another world, you could ask something like, within an action movie, how do the computer-enhanced or computer-generated sequences contribute to your enjoyment? Number 6 is something we've already talked about with avoiding bias. You can reduce bias in the way you write the questions as well. For example, for the smoke-free campus example we've been using throughout the course, you could just ask in an interview, tell me about your opinion of a smoke-free campus policy. If you say something like, tobacco kills up to half its users, tell me what you think about smoke-free policies, that question is loaded because it introduces negative perception of smoking and could influence someone's response. They could feel pressured that they need to say the smoke-free policy is good, even if they don't think that. So make sure that you're avoiding bias in the way you word your questions, the tone you use, and also even your inflection when you ask it. Number 7 is clarity issues. It's important that researchers understand what the person answering the questions wants to convey. So if you're ever not sure, you can ask for that clarification. If an interviewee says something like, the pizza offered in the cafeteria isn't good, they don't offer enough topping selection, you could ask about what is wrong with the topping selection. Like, are there no vegetarian options? Do you want more gourmet options rather than just like the typical pepperoni and cheese? Asking for clarification on why they think the topping selection is not adequate is the only way you could actually make changes in the cafeteria offerings. So you need that information. Don't be afraid to ask. Number 8. You can help the respondent think through issues by giving prompts. If they ever say, I don't know, you could try to ask more questions. For the pizza example again, you could try to help them narrow their thoughts by asking things like, what type of pizza would you prefer to see in the cafeteria? Vegetarian or deluxe? Then if they like vegetarian, you could follow up with another question. Well, if you had to pick between vegetarian and Greek, which one would you want to see in the cafeteria? And you can use this kind of process of elimination method to help them and prompt them throughout the interview. Finally, you should end the interview on time. If the interviewee was told it would take 30 minutes, you should not exceed that time frame. Make sure that the interviewee is always thanked for their time and participation. You should transcribe any written notes taken from the interview right away, and also make sure you follow up with instructions for the interviewee about if they need to collect any prize or monetary compensation for participating in the interview, how they can do that, but you need to have a designated end. All of these 9 tips can help you to avoid bias in interviewing.